Chapter 1. The Soldier's Return. Dan Banks had killed 17 men in his career, each death precise and necessary. As he adjusted his dress blues in the bathroom mirror of the military transport, he thought about home, about Ellen's warm smile and 8-year-old Tommy's excited chatter about baseball cards. 3 months of classified operations in Eastern Europe had felt like a lifetime, but the mission was complete. The arms dealer they'd been tracking was now feeding fish in the Danube. Dan's reflection showed a man carved from granite, 6 feet 2 inches, weathered face marked by a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Kandahar. His steel-gray eyes had seen too much, but they softened when he thought of his family. Ellen Grimes had been his anchor since they'd met 7 years ago at a veterans support group. She'd lost her first husband in Iraq, understood the weight soldiers carried. When they married 2 years later, Dan inherited 5-year-old Tommy, and the boy became the son he'd never had. The plane touched down at Fort Bragg at 1,400 hours. Dan's commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, pulled him aside before dismissal. "Banks, you've got 2 weeks leave. Then we need to discuss your next assignment. There's talk of a promotion, maybe a training position stateside." Dan nodded, distracted. He'd called Ellen that morning, told her he was coming home early, wanted to surprise Tommy at his Little League game. Her voice had sounded strange, distant, probably just the stress of single parenting while he was deployed. The drive to their modest 2-story house in Fayetteville should have taken 40 minutes. Dan made it in 30, eager to hold his family. As he turned onto Maple Street, something felt wrong. His training kicked in, heightened awareness, scanning for threats. A sheriff's department cruiser sat in his driveway, North Carolina plates, local county. Not unusual. Ellen volunteered with the police auxiliary. Maybe just a social visit. But Dan's instincts, honed by years of staying alive in hostile territory, screamed danger. He parked across the street, observing. The house looked normal, Ellen's Honda in the garage, Tommy's bike on the front lawn. But the living room curtains were drawn tight, and it was only 3 in the afternoon. Ellen always kept them open. She loved natural light. Dan moved with the silence of a predator, using his key to enter through the back door. The kitchen was pristine, too clean. Ellen was neat, but not obsessive. This felt staged. He heard voices from upstairs, Ellen's laugh, high and breathless, followed by a man's deeper chuckle. Dan's jaw clenched. The sounds were intimate, private. As he moved toward the stairs, a muffled sound from below caught his attention. The basement. A thumping, rhythmic and desperate. Dan's blood turned to ice. "Tommy," he whispered. The basement door was locked from the outside. A deadbolt Ellen claimed was for storage security. Dan had installed it himself. His hands shook as he turned the lock, and what he found downstairs would haunt him forever. The basement had been converted into something from a nightmare. Tommy sat chained to the support beam, his wrists raw from struggle. Duct tape covered his mouth, his eyes wide with terror and relief when he saw his father. But it was the setup around him that made Dan's vision go red. Video cameras on tripods, professional lighting, a laptop open and recording. "Dad!" Tommy's muffled scream came through the tape as Dan rushed to free him. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. "What the hell are you doing here?" The voice was commanding, authoritative. Dan turned to see a tall man in sheriff's uniform, mid-40s, blonde hair, and cold blue eyes. His name tag read K. O'Neill. Behind him, Ellen appeared, her face pale, wearing only a silk robe. "Dan, you weren't supposed to be back until..." "Until when?" Dan's voice was deadly quiet as he pulled Tommy close, the boy clinging to him and sobbing. "Until you finished whatever sick game this is." Sheriff Kelvin O'Neill's hand moved to his weapon. "You need to calm down, soldier boy. You're interfering with official police business." Dan's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Official business? Is that what you call chaining an 8-year-old in a basement?" "Let's see how long he survives," Ellen said, her voice taking on a cruel edge Dan had never heard before. That's what we were going to find out. The woman he'd loved, trusted, married, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger. A monster. "You made a grave mistake," Dan said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "You hurt my son." Chapter 2. Revelations in Blood. The standoff lasted 3 seconds. Dan Banks had survived Fallujah, Helmand Province, and countless classified operations because he could process threat assessments faster than most people could blink. Sheriff Kelvin O'Neill was reaching for his service weapon. Ellen was backing toward what looked like a panic button mounted on the basement wall, and Tommy, his son in every way that mattered, was traumatized and needed immediate medical attention. Dan moved like death itself. His left hand caught O'Neill's wrist as the gun cleared leather, twisting with surgical precision until bones snapped. The weapon clattered across the concrete floor. His right elbow drove into the sheriff's solar plexus, dropping him to his knees, gasping. Ellen's hand was inches from the alarm when Dan's voice stopped her cold. "Touch that button, and I'll break every bone in your body before I let you bleed out." She froze, recognizing something in his tone, the voice of a man who'd killed without hesitation and would do so again. "Tommy, close your eyes," Dan commanded, never taking his gaze off the two people who'd destroyed his world. The boy buried his face in Dan's shoulder. "Now," Dan continued, his voice conversational but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you're going to explain what this is. All of it." O'Neill was clutching his broken wrist, his face twisted in pain and fury. "You have no idea what you've walked into, Banks. This goes deeper than—" "Shut up, Kelvin," Ellen snapped, then caught herself. The slip was telling. Dan's eyes narrowed. "Kelvin? Not Sheriff O'Neill. How long has this been going on, Ellen?" The woman he'd married looked nothing like the grieving widow he'd fallen in love with. Her face was hard, calculating. When she spoke, her voice carried a venom he'd never heard before. "Since 2 weeks after you deployed, if you must know. Kelvin and I have certain shared interests." Dan's gaze swept the basement again, taking in details he'd missed in his initial rage. This wasn't hastily assembled. The lighting rig was professional grade, the cameras expensive. Multiple memory cards sat on a nearby table. The laptop showed a paused video, Tommy struggling against his chains while Ellen and O'Neill watched, commenting. "How many others?" Dan's question was barely audible. "What?" Ellen asked. "How many other children have you done this to?" The silence was answer enough. Dan had interrogated enemy combatants, broken-hearted terrorists. He knew how to read people. Ellen's micro-expressions, the way O'Neill's eyes darted to a filing cabinet in the corner, the defensive positioning of their bodies. They weren't just sick. They were prolific. The support group, Dan realized aloud. You targeted widows, single mothers. Got close to their families. Ellen's smile was cold. "Grief makes people so trusting. So grateful for attention. And your official position gave you access," Dan added, looking at O'Neill. "How many officers are involved in this?" "Enough," O'Neill snarled. "You think you can just waltz in here and play hero? We own this county. We." Dan's boot connected with O'Neill's ribs, sending him sprawling. "I asked how many." From the filing cabinet, he pulled out folders. Names, addresses, photographs of children. His hands shook as he rifled through them. Dozens of files. Some marked completed. Others labeled in progress. Tommy Baird, age 7. Completed. Michelle Dickerson's daughter, age 6. Completed. Martha Alexander's twin boys, age 9. In progress. "You've been hunting children," Dan whispered, the full scope of their operation becoming clear. "Ellen, you married me for cover. The grieving widow who found love again with a deployed soldier. Someone who'd be gone for months at a time. You were perfect," she confirmed. "No family nearby, classified work, couldn't discuss your schedule. And Tommy was such a sweet bonus." Dan wanted to kill them both right there. His hands twitched toward O'Neill's dropped weapon. But Tommy needed him rational, needed him to think beyond his rage. These files represented other children, other families. This network had to be completely destroyed, root and branch. "How does the network operate?" he asked. Ellen laughed. "You think we're going to give you some dramatic villain monologue? You watch too many movies, Dan." "No," Dan said quietly, pulling out his combat knife. "You're going to tell me because the alternative is me taking pieces off you until you do. I've had extensive training in battlefield interrogation techniques." The blade caught the basement's harsh lighting. Ellen's confidence wavered. "The families trust you," Dan continued, thinking aloud. "Ellen provides emotional support, identifies vulnerable children. Kelvin uses his position to create opportunities, wellness checks, safety programs, situations where children are isolated." "Stop," Ellen whispered. "But what's the endgame? These completed files, what happened to those children?" O'Neill was backing against the wall, cradling his broken wrist. "You don't understand the power structures involved here. This isn't just local. We have protection from. Kelvin. Ellen's warning came too late. Federal level? Dan asked. State? How high does this go? The silence stretched. Dan looked at his wife, this stranger wearing Ellen's face, and felt something die inside him. Not love, that had been murdered the moment he found Tommy chained in their basement, but any remaining trace of the man who'd believed in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that people could change. That man was gone forever. Tommy, he said gently, I need you to go upstairs. Call Uncle Marcus. Marcus Webb was Dan's former squad leader, now working private security in Charlotte. Tell him code black. He'll understand. As Tommy climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, Dan turned back to his prisoners. Because that's what they were now. Prisoners of war in a conflict they'd started the moment they touched his son. Here's what's going to happen, Dan said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. You're going to give me every name, every location, every detail of this operation. Then you're going to help me destroy it completely. And if we refuse? O'Neill challenged. Dan's smile was empty of everything except promise. Then I'll show you why they sent me to places that don't exist on maps to do things that never happened. Chapter 3. The Art of War. Marcus Webb arrived within 90 minutes, bringing equipment that would have made the NSA envious. Dan's former team leader took one look at the basement setup and didn't ask questions. He simply began documenting everything with military precision. The two men had been through enough black operations together to communicate with glances and gestures. How deep? Marcus asked, photographing the filing cabinet contents. Federal connections, according to our friend here. Dan nodded toward O'Neill, who was zip-tied to a chair. Ellen sat similarly restrained nearby, her earlier arrogance replaced by growing fear. Marcus whistled low. That complicates extraction. Doesn't complicate elimination. While Marcus worked, Dan studied the network structure. It was more sophisticated than he'd initially realized. Ellen and O'Neill weren't just opportunistic predators. They were part of a coordinated system. The files revealed a pattern. Children were selected, isolated, and either used for local production or relocated to facilities in other states. The completed files weren't deaths, Dan realized with growing horror. They were sales records. Transport manifests, he said, finding a separate folder. They're trafficking them. Ellen finally spoke, her voice desperate. Dan, you have to understand. We never killed anyone. These children, they're going to people who can provide for them, give them better lives. Dan's backhand sent her chair skidding across the concrete. Better lives? Tommy was chained to a wall while you filmed him. Was that better? That was Kelvin's idea. He said we needed insurance, something to keep you in line when you got back. Insurance. Dan's voice was deadly quiet. O'Neill looked up from where he'd been feigning unconsciousness. We knew about your next assignment. Training position at Quantico. FBI liaison work. We needed someone on the inside. The scope of their plan hit Dan like a physical blow. They'd orchestrated everything. The marriage, the adoption, his military career trajectory. He wasn't a husband who'd been betrayed. He was a mark who'd been played from the beginning. How long has this been planned? He demanded. 3 years, Ellen admitted. Since we identified you as a high-value target. Marcus paused his documentation. Target for what? Recruitment, O'Neill said. The network always needs military assets. Especially special operations personnel with clean records and psychological evaluation scores indicating strong moral flexibility under pressure. Moral flexibility, Dan repeated. You thought torture would make me join you? We thought finding Tommy's body would break you. Ellen said matter-of-factly. Grief makes people malleable. Then Kelvin would investigate, be your shoulder to cry on, introduce you to opportunities for financial enhancement. It's worked before. Dan stood perfectly still, processing the revelation. They'd planned to murder Tommy, then use his grief to recruit him into child trafficking. The cold calculation of it was staggering. The other families, he said. How many military targets? 17 active recruitments. O'Neill answered, perhaps hoping cooperation might save his life. Different approaches for different psychological profiles. Some through romance, others through financial pressure, blackmail, or family threats. Marcus held up a file marked Operation Broken Arrow. Inside were psychological profiles of special operations personnel, their weaknesses, their families. Dan's own profile was there, marked Primary Target, Phase 3. Phase 3. Marcus asked. Activation, Ellen explained. Once recruited, assets are given increasingly sensitive assignments. Eventually, they become full operational partners. Dan realized the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a local trafficking ring. It was a systematic corruption network targeting the military's most elite units. How many good soldiers had been turned? How many children had been sacrificed to build this cancer inside America's defense structure? Communications, he said. How do you coordinate with other cells? Neither answered. Dan picked up his knife. I'm going to count to 3. Then I start removing fingers. Encrypted messaging app, O'Neill said quickly. Each cell leader has direct contact with regional coordinators. We don't know the full structure, compartmentalized for security. Show me. O'Neill's phone required his biometric unlock. Dan pressed the man's thumb to the screen, accessing a messaging interface unlike anything civilian. Military-grade encryption, but the conversation histories revealed the network's tentacles reaching across multiple states, multiple agencies. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed, reading over Dan's shoulder. ATF, DEA, state police, sheriff's departments, federal contractors. This is a full-spectrum infiltration. Dan scrolled through operational summaries. The network had been building for over a decade, starting small with local corruption, expanding into human trafficking, and now approaching something that looked disturbingly like a shadow government. Who runs it, he asked. We don't know, Ellen said. Orders come down through cutouts. Regional coordinators report to state coordinators. They report to someone we've never met. Dan didn't believe her. Someone this organized, this careful, wouldn't compartmentalize completely. There had to be face-to-face meetings, verification protocols, trust-building exercises. He was about to push harder when Marcus grabbed his arm. Vehicle approaching. 2 minutes out. Dan looked at the security monitors Marcus had activated. A black SUV with government plates was turning onto their street. Not police, not military. The kind of unmarked vehicle that meant federal law enforcement or intelligence services. Backup, Dan asked his prisoners. More like cleanup, O'Neill said with a sick smile. We missed our last check-in. Protocol dictates immediate site sanitization. Sanitization? Everyone dies, Ellen explained helpfully. Including you and Tommy. Car accident, gas leak, murder-suicide. They have people who specialize in making problems disappear. Dan's mind raced. The basement was a tactical nightmare. 1 entrance, no cover, 2 hostages who couldn't be moved quickly. Upstairs, Tommy was vulnerable. The approaching team would have superior numbers, federal resources, and no constraints on collateral damage. But Dan Banks hadn't earned his reputation by fighting fair battles. Marcus, how much C4 did you bring? 2 pounds. What? Because we're about to teach these federal bastards what happens when you threaten family. Dan's smile was the last thing either Ellen or O'Neill ever saw. Chapter 4, Blood Debts. The explosion took out the basement, the foundation, and the better part of the first floor. Dan and Marcus had evacuated Tommy through the storm drainage system behind the house 60 seconds before the charges detonated. From their position in the neighboring woods, they watched the black SUV's occupants race toward the burning ruins, their tactical formation professional but useless against an enemy who'd already repositioned. 4-man team, Marcus observed through binoculars. Federal gear, but no identifying marks. Shadow units, Dan said. Probably CIA or DHS contractors. Tommy was wrapped in Dan's jacket, still processing the reality that his home had just been reduced to smoking rubble. Are Ellen and the sheriff dead? He asked quietly. Yes, Dan answered without hesitation. They can't hurt you anymore. The boy nodded, dry-eyed. At 8 years old, he'd already learned that some people wore friendly masks while harboring monsters underneath. That lesson would serve him well in the years to come. Dan's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. We have more children. Cease operations, or they die. They're fast, Marcus noted. Network response within 15 minutes of the explosion. Which means they're local, Dan replied, typing back. Locations and proof of life, or I burn down everything. The response was immediate. Photographs of 5 children, ages ranging from 6 to 10, zip-tied in what looked like a warehouse. Dan recognized 2 faces from the basement files, Martha Alexander's twins, listed as in progress. Warehouse District, Industrial Road. Come alone. Obviously a trap, Marcus said. Obviously, Dan agreed. Which is why we're not walking into it. Instead, they spent the next hour conducting reconnaissance from multiple angles. The warehouse was isolated, perfect for an ambush, but it also offered advantages for someone willing to think asymmetrically. Dan had spent years fighting enemies who used human shields, who hid among civilians, who believed Western soldiers were constrained by rules of engagement. Those enemies had never met anyone like Dan Banks. Perimeter security? He asked. 6 men, rotating patrol pattern every 20 minutes. Professionals, but they're expecting a frontal assault or negotiation attempt. They're not expecting total war. The plan Dan outlined was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Marcus would create a diversion on the east side of the building, explosives designed to look like an assault team breach. While security responded to that threat, Dan would infiltrate from the south, where thermal imaging showed the children were being held. Rules of engagement? Marcus asked. No survivors, Dan said simply. This network has been operating for over a decade. How many children do you think they've processed in that time? How many families destroyed? Marcus nodded. What about extraction? Once the children are secure, we continue up the chain. Ellen mentioned regional coordinators, state-level operations. We hunt them all. That's not a mission, Dan. That's a crusade. Then we better start praying. The assault began at 2,100 hours. Marcus's diversionary explosives lit up the night, drawing security forces toward what appeared to be a multi-vector attack from the east. Dan used the chaos to penetrate the south wall, moving through the warehouse's interior like a shadow. He found the children in a converted office space, guarded by 2 men who were too focused on the explosions outside to notice death approaching from behind. Dan's knife work was silent, efficient, practiced. The guards died without making a sound. I'm here to take you home, he whispered to the terrified children as he cut their restraints. Stay quiet, stay close, do exactly what I say. Martha Alexander's twins, Bobby and Jerry Paul, looked up at him with the hollow eyes of children who'd lost faith in adult protection. But they followed his instructions, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped, trusting him because they had no other choice. The extraction should have been clean. Dan had neutralized 6 more security personnel during their movement toward the exit, each kill surgical and silent. But as they reached the rendezvous point where Marcus waited with the vehicle, a familiar voice stopped him cold. Dan Banks, the great American hero. Dan turned, pushing the children behind him. Colonel Martinez, his commanding officer, stood 50 feet away with a rifle trained on them. Behind him were 4 more soldiers in combat gear, men Dan recognized from his own unit. Sir, Dan's voice carried a lifetime of military conditioning, even as his mind raced to process this betrayal. Did you really think we'd let you demolish years of careful cultivation over one compromised cell? Martinez asked. The network has hundreds of assets, Banks. Military, law enforcement, intelligence services. What you stumbled into tonight was expendable. These are children, Colonel. These are assets, Martinez corrected. Valuable commodities in a very lucrative market. And you're about to become one too. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Dan had been allowed to rescue the children, to feel like he was winning, so that his capture would be more psychologically devastating. They wanted to break him completely before recruitment, to ensure his loyalty through trauma bonding. They'd made one critical miscalculation. Dan Banks was already broken, had been since the moment he found Tommy chained in their basement. What stood before them now wasn't a soldier constrained by law or morality or chain of command. It was something much more dangerous, a father with nothing left to lose. Marcus, he said quietly into his comm unit. Light them up. The sniper rifle's report echoed across the warehouse district as Colonel Martinez's head exploded like a watermelon. Before his body hit the ground, Dan was moving, the children forgotten as he transitioned into full combat mode. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, 4 of America's elite special operations personnel lay dead in the parking lot, killed by men they'd trained, men they'd betrayed, men who understood that some lines, once crossed, erased every bond that had previously existed. Dad, Tommy's voice came from the vehicle where Marcus had positioned the rescued children. Dan looked down at his hands, covered in blood, at the bodies around him, at the children who'd witnessed yet another demonstration of adult brutality. He thought about the network, the scope of corruption, The impossibility of fighting an enemy embedded within the very institutions meant to protect innocence. "We're going to need help," he told Marcus. "What kind of help?" Dan's smile was empty of warmth, but full of promise. "The kind that doesn't ask questions and doesn't leave witnesses." Chapter 5, Gathering Storms. The Safe House was an abandoned auto shop on the outskirts of Charlotte, one of dozens of off-grid locations Marcus maintained through his private security contacts. Dan sat at a folding table covered with files, photographs, and electronic devices recovered from the warehouse. The rescued children slept fitfully in the back office, their dreams haunted by experiences no child should endure. Tommy was different from the others. He hadn't spoken since leaving the warehouse, hadn't cried, hadn't shown any of the normal reactions Dan expected from an 8-year-old who'd witnessed multiple violent deaths. Instead, he'd helped organize the evidence with disturbing efficiency, his young mind already adapting to a world where monsters wore badges and uniforms. "We've got a problem," Marcus announced, returning from his communications setup. "The explosion at your house made national news. Domestic terrorism investigation, FBI task force, the works." "Cover story?" Dan asked without looking up from Colonel Martinez's encrypted phone. "Gas leak explosion killed 3 people, you, Ellen, and Sheriff O'Neill. Tommy's body was too damaged to identify, but he's presumed dead. You're officially a ghost." "Good. Dead men don't leave paper trails." Dan had been systematically penetrating the network's communications for 6 hours. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The operation was vast beyond his initial estimates. Coordinated trafficking networks in 47 states, international connections spanning 6 continents, and a client base that included high-ranking government officials, corporate executives, and foreign intelligence services. "How many children?" Marcus asked, reading over his shoulder. "Conservative estimate? 10,000 processed through the system in the last 5 years alone." Dan's voice was clinically detached, but his hands shook as he scrolled through the transaction records. Average price point between 50 and 200,000, depending on age, appearance, and specifications. Specifications? Training. Some clients prefer children who've been broken in specific ways. Others want them completely undamaged. The network accommodates both markets. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "That's not law enforcement corruption, Dan. That's a parallel economy. With revenue streams approaching $2 billion annually," Dan confirmed. "They're not just trafficking children, they're farming them. Foster systems, overseas orphanages, refugee programs. All compromised, all feeding into this machine." The scope was staggering. What Dan had initially thought was a regional trafficking ring was actually a sophisticated international enterprise with the resources and protection of a small nation. Fighting it through traditional channels would be impossible. Too many judges bought, too many legislators compromised, too many law enforcement agencies infiltrated. But Dan wasn't planning to fight through traditional channels. "I need Henry Goodwin," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The fixer?" "Dan, that man is completely off the reservation. No government oversight, no rules of engagement, no accountability." Exactly. Henry Goodwin had been Dan's handler during his most classified operations, the missions that didn't exist, in countries America had never officially entered, targeting individuals who'd never been officially identified. When Goodwin disappeared from government service 5 years ago, rumors suggested he'd gone freelance, offering his services to the highest bidder. Dan was betting those rumors were true. "How do we find him?" Marcus asked. "We don't. He finds us." Dan activated an emergency communication protocol he'd memorized but never used. A series of coded messages posted to specific online forums, designed to reach Goodwin wherever he might be operating. The response came within 2 hours. Coordinates for a meeting in an abandoned textile mill outside Greensboro. "Could be a trap," Marcus warned. "Everything's a trap now," Dan replied. "The question is whether we spring it first." They arrived at the textile mill armed for war, but Goodwin was waiting alone, sitting on a concrete ledge and smoking a cigarette. He looked older than Dan remembered, gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, the worn appearance of a man who'd stared into humanity's darkest corners and lost pieces of his soul along the way. "Dan Banks," Goodwin said without turning around. "I heard you died in a gas explosion. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." along with your wife and son, according to the news reports. Goodwin's eyes found Tommy, who stood beside Dan with the watchful stillness of a child who'd learned that safety was temporary. Interesting. I need your help, Henry. I gathered that from your rather dramatic communication method. Goodwin stubbed out his cigarette. What's the target? Dan handed him a folder containing everything they'd uncovered about the network. Goodwin read in silence, his expression never changing, but Dan noticed his hands tighten on the papers. Ambitious, Goodwin said finally. Stupid, but ambitious. You want to declare war on an organization with billions in resources, federal protection, and international connections. Yes. Using what army? Whatever army you can provide. Goodwin laughed, but there was no humor in it. My services don't come cheap, Dan. And this isn't the kind of job with a high survival rate. Name your price. Complete operational autonomy. No oversight. No rules of engagement. No questions about methods or casualties. Done. And when it's over, when this network is completely destroyed, you and I never met. You know nothing about what happens next. Dan considered this. What happens next? International expansion. There are similar networks in Europe, Asia, South America. All connected, all feeding the same global market. Destroying the American operation will just be the beginning. The implications hit Dan like a physical blow. This wasn't about saving his son or getting revenge on Ellen and O'Neill. This was about uncovering a cancer that had metastasized throughout human civilization itself. How long have you known? He asked. Years, Goodwin admitted. I've been building assets, gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to move. Your little domestic situation just provided the perfect catalyst. You've been watching me. I've been watching everyone, Dan. The network recruits from military special operations for a reason. We're the only people with the skills and moral flexibility to fight them effectively. Dan realized he was being recruited again, but this time for a war he believed in. What do you need from me? Everything. Complete access to your intelligence, your contacts, your son's testimony about network operations. Tommy's 8 years old. Tommy's 8 years old and has seen more of their operational structure than most federal investigators. Children notice things adults miss: faces, voices, procedures, security measures. Dan looked at his son, this boy who'd been through hell but was still standing, still fighting, still trusting him to make the right choices. Tommy, what do you think? The boy's voice was steady, older than his years. I think they hurt other kids like they hurt me. And I think someone should stop them. Goodwin smiled, the first genuine expression Dan had seen from him. I like this kid. He's got potential. For what? Survival, Goodwin said simply. In the war that's coming, that's going to be the most valuable skill of all. Chapter 6, Rules of Engagement. The war began at 0300 hours on a Tuesday morning with the systematic elimination of 7 network coordinators across 4 states. Goodwin's assets moved like shadows. Former special operations personnel, intelligence operatives, and mercenaries who'd been cast out by various governments for being too efficient at violence. They struck simultaneously, precisely, leaving no survivors and no evidence that could be traced back to any organization or individual. Dan coordinated from the Charlotte safe house, using encrypted communications to track progress and adjust targets based on real-time intelligence. Tommy had provided detailed descriptions of the men who'd visited Ellen and O'Neill, and facial recognition software had identified 12 key players in the regional network. By dawn, 8 of them were dead. Response time, Dan asked as reports filtered in. Faster than expected, Goodwin replied through the secure link. Federal task forces mobilizing in all affected areas. Someone high up is making phone calls. How high? High enough to coordinate FBI, DEA, and DHS assets within 6 hours of the first hit. This has cabinet-level attention. Dan processed this information while studying the network's communication traffic. The simultaneous strikes had triggered emergency protocols, safe houses being evacuated, assets being relocated, operations being suspended. But they'd also revealed the network's true scope through their panic responses. They're pulling back to hardened positions, Marcus observed, monitoring electronic intercepts, consolidating in 3 primary locations. The locations were strategically chosen: a private military contractor's compound in Virginia, a federal law enforcement training facility in Georgia, and a religious retreat in Montana that served as cover for a broader operation. Each site was heavily defended, officially sanctioned, and legally untouchable through conventional law enforcement. Fortress strategy, Dan said. They're betting we don't have the resources for sustained siege operations. Do we? Marcus asked. We're about to find out. Tommy had been quiet through the morning briefings, sitting in the corner with a tablet computer and the network's recovered files. Dan had given him access to the children's photographs, hoping he might recognize faces or provide additional intelligence about the trafficking operations. What he hadn't expected was for his 8-year-old son to become a tactical analyst. Dad, Tommy said, looking up from the screen. I think there's something else. What do you mean? Tommy pulled up a series of financial records that had been recovered from Colonel Martinez's files. These numbers don't match. Dan looked over his son's shoulder at columns of figures that meant nothing to him. I don't understand. The children, Tommy explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing inventory. They're saying they processed 10,000 kids, but the money they received was for maybe 3,000. Marcus joined them, studying the financial analysis Tommy had performed. The kid's right. Revenue projections versus actual payments show a significant discrepancy. What does that mean? Dan asked. It means they're lying about the numbers, Tommy said. Either they processed fewer children, or some of them weren't sold, Marcus finished. They were kept. The implications sent ice through Dan's veins. If 7,000 children hadn't been trafficked to external buyers, where were they? What was the network doing with them that was more valuable than immediate sale? Research. Goodwin's voice came through the comm system as he returned from coordinating the next phase of operations. Medical experimentation, psychological conditioning, specialized training programs. The network isn't just trafficking children. They're manufacturing them. Manufacturing them for what? Next-generation assets. Operatives who've been conditioned from childhood to follow orders without question, to adapt to any environment, to feel no emotional attachment to targets or operations. Dan thought about Tommy's unusual calmness during the violence, his analytical approach to the network structure, his acceptance of necessary brutality. How long does the conditioning take? Varies by age and psychological profile. But generally speaking, children processed through the system emerge as functional sociopaths with specialized skills. And the ones who don't adapt? Disposed of, Goodwin said simply. The network has a very high standards for quality control. Dan was quiet for a long moment, studying his son with new eyes. Tommy had been scheduled for processing, had survived the initial stages of the network's program. How much conditioning had already occurred? How much of his calm acceptance was natural resilience? And how much was programmed response? The 3 facilities, Dan said, changing the subject before his thoughts could spiral further. What's our approach? Simultaneous assault, Goodwin replied. Overwhelming force, maximum casualties, complete destruction. No prisoners, no survivors, no evidence left behind. Collateral damage? Acceptable. These facilities process hundreds of children annually. Whatever losses we incur in the assault will be insignificant compared to the lives saved by permanent shutdown. Marcus was studying satellite imagery of the 3 targets. The Virginia compound has military-grade defenses, anti-aircraft systems, hardened bunkers, reaction forces. This isn't a raid, it's a military operation. Which is why we're not conducting a raid, Goodwin said. We're conducting a siege. The plan Goodwin outlined was breathtaking in its scope and brutality. Rather than direct assault, they would systematically eliminate the infrastructure supporting each facility, power grids, communications networks, supply chains, personnel transportation. The defenders would be isolated, blinded, and slowly starved of resources until they either surrendered or died of attrition. Timeline? Dan asked. 2 weeks for complete isolation. Another week for them to realize no help is coming. Final assault when they're weak enough to offer minimal resistance. And the children inside? Unknown variables, Goodwin admitted. Some facilities use children as human shields. Others have contingency plans for mass elimination to prevent rescue. We'll adapt tactics based on intelligence gathered during the siege phase. Dan realized they were discussing the possible deaths of hundreds of children with the same clinical detachment the network had shown. The war against monsters was turning them into monsters themselves. There has to be another way, he said. There is, Goodwin replied. We can walk away. Let the network rebuild, find new facilities, process thousands more children through their system. Your choice, Dan. Dan looked at Tommy, at Marcus, at the evidence of systematic evil spread across the table. He thought about the children in the warehouse, about Martha Alexander's twins, about all the families destroyed by the network's operations. When do we start? He asked. Goodwin's smile was cold and final. We already have. Chapter 7, Siege. The power went out at the Virginia compound on Thursday morning, followed by communications blackout 30 minutes later. By Friday, the water treatment facilities serving the area had suffered a catastrophic failure that local authorities blamed on aging infrastructure. Weekend supply trucks never arrived due to a series of highway accidents that blocked all major access routes. Dan monitored the siege operations from a command post Goodwin had established in an abandoned radio station 40 miles from the compound. Banks of computers showed real-time intelligence from surveillance drones, communication intercepts, and human assets positioned around each target facility. The network's strongholds were being systematically strangled without a single shot being fired. Day 3 status? Dan asked. Virginia compound has switched to backup generators, but fuel supplies are limited, Goodwin reported. Georgia facility is operating on emergency protocols. Montana retreat attempted to evacuate yesterday, but lost 3 vehicles to roadway explosives. Casualties? Minimal on our side. They've lost 37 personnel total across all 3 facilities. Dan studied the tactical displays showing each facility's status. Red indicators marked infrastructure failures. Yellow showed degraded capabilities. Green meant operational systems. The screens were almost entirely red now. How many children are inside? He asked. Best estimates suggest 400 to 500 total across all 3 facilities, Marcus replied, monitoring communication intercepts. But we're seeing references to something called Protocol 7 in their emergency transmissions, which is unknown. The communications are too fragmented to provide context. Tommy looked up from the corner where he'd been working with the recovered files. Protocol 7 is termination, he said quietly. Both men turned to stare at the 8-year-old. How do you know that? Dan asked. Ellen talked about it sometimes. On the phone. If operations were compromised, if rescue was imminent, if the network was threatened with exposure. Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. Kill all the children, destroy all evidence, blame external terrorists. Mass murder, Marcus breathed. Insurance, Tommy corrected. Dead children can't testify. Destroyed facilities can't be investigated. Terrorist attacks justify increased security funding. Dan felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long before they implement Protocol 7? Usually 72 hours after initial compromise detection, Tommy replied, consulting his notes. But variables include external pressure, media attention, and assessment of rescue probability. Which means, tomorrow, Goodwin said, having listened to the conversation. They implement tomorrow morning, which means we assault tonight. The plan for simultaneous assault had been refined over 3 days of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Each facility would be hit by separate teams using different tactics. The Virginia compound required heavy assault due to its military defenses. Georgia would be infiltrated through their compromised water system, and Montana would face a siege-breaking ground attack designed to look like domestic terrorism. Rules of engagement? Dan asked. Kill everyone except children, Goodwin replied. Anyone old enough to be complicit in the operation dies. Anyone young enough to be a victim gets extracted. How do we tell the difference? Age cutoff is 16. Below that, they're victims. Above that, they're combatants. Dan thought about teenage victims who might have been conditioned into compliance, about young adults who'd been processed through the system and emerged as operational assets. The age cutoff was arbitrary, brutal, and probably the best they could do under the circumstances. What about evidence preservation? Marcus asked. Secondary priority, Goodwin said. Children first, intelligence second, everything else is expendable. The briefing continued for another hour, covering extraction routes, communication protocols, and contingency plans for everything from air support to nuclear attack. Goodwin's operation had resources Dan hadn't imagined. Private military contractors, foreign intelligence assets, and technology that officially didn't exist. Who's funding this? Dan asked during a break. People who've been waiting for someone to declare war on the network, Goodwin replied. Wealthy families whose children were taken, foreign governments tired of their citizens being trafficked, intelligence services that lost personnel to network recruitment efforts. How long have you been planning this? 8 years. Since my own daughter disappeared during a school trip to Washington, D.C. Dan went quiet. He'd never known Goodwin had a family, had never thought about the personal motivations driving this operation. Did you find her? 2 years ago, in a facility in Thailand, completely broken, completely programmed. Goodwin's voice was steady, controlled. She didn't recognize me, didn't remember her name, her childhood, her life before. They'd turned her into something else entirely. What happened to her? She's in a specialized facility now. Deprogramming, therapy, attempting to rebuild some semblance of human emotion. Goodwin looked directly at Dan. The doctors say she might recover basic function within 5 to 10 years. She might never remember being my daughter. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be effective. As night fell, the assault teams moved into position around each target facility. Dan found himself assigned to the Virginia compound, leading a 12-man team through the perimeter defenses that had been systematically degraded over the past 3 days. Tommy remained at the command post with Marcus, monitoring communications and providing tactical intelligence based on his knowledge of network procedures. Overwatch in position, came the report through Dan's earpiece. Breach teams ready. Support elements standing by. Dan looked at the compound through his night vision scope. 3 days of siege had taken their toll. Emergency lighting instead of full illumination, reduced patrol patterns, defensive positions that suggested desperation rather than confidence. Execute, Goodwin commanded. The war's final phase began with silence broken by sudden, devastating violence. Chapter 8, Blood and Fire. The assault on the Virginia compound lasted 47 minutes and left the facility looking like a war zone. Dan's team had breached through the eastern perimeter while diversionary attacks drew defenders toward multiple false targets. By the time the network's security forces realized the true nature of the assault, half their personnel were dead and the facility's children were being evacuated through tunnels Dan hadn't known existed. 63 children extracted, Marcus reported through the comm system as Dan moved through the compound's administrative sections. Ages 4 to 15, various states of conditioning and physical trauma. Opposition casualties? Dan asked, stepping over the body of a guard who'd been trying to execute children when Dan's bullets found him. All hostile personnel neutralized. No survivors. Dan had stopped counting his personal kills after the first dozen. The network's defenders had fought with the desperation of men who knew capture meant either life imprisonment or immediate execution, but they'd been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely unprepared for an enemy with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Administrative sections secured, he reported, finding himself in what appeared to be the facility's command center. Banks of computers showed operational data from sites across the globe. The American network was apparently just one branch of an international operation spanning every continent. Georgia facility reporting successful extraction. Came another voice through the comm, 41 children recovered, facility destroyed. Montana status? Complications. They implemented Protocol 7 before we breached. 38 children confirmed dead, perpetrators eliminated. Dan felt the weight of those 38 deaths settle on his shoulders. 38 children who might have been saved if they'd moved faster, planned better, anticipated the network's desperation more accurately. Download everything. Goodwin's voice cut through his guilt. We need complete intelligence on global operations. Dan began copying files from the command center's servers, transferring terabytes of data that would take months to analyze fully. Transaction records, personnel files, operational procedures, client databases, everything the network had accumulated over years of systematic evil. Movement on the perimeter, someone reported. Federal vehicles approaching from multiple directions. How many? Convoy strength. Looks like a full federal response. Dan realized they were about to transition from rescue operation to firefight with American law enforcement. The network's federal connections were mobilizing to protect their investment, probably with orders to eliminate all witnesses and classify the entire incident. Extraction protocols? He asked. Negative, Goodwin replied. We hold position and complete the mission. Against federal agents? Against enemy combatants wearing federal uniforms. The distinction was important. Dan had spent his career following orders, respecting authority, believing in the institutions he'd sworn to protect. But those institutions had been compromised, corrupted, turned into weapons against the innocent. The federal agents approaching weren't coming to rescue children or arrest criminals. They were coming to preserve a system that trafficked human beings for profit. ROE confirmed. Dan said into his comm, "Anyone not wearing our colors is hostile." The siege's second phase began when federal vehicles surrounded the compound and loudspeakers announced demands for immediate surrender. Dan could see the tactical teams deploying, professional movements that suggested military or paramilitary training. These weren't ordinary federal agents. They were specialists, the kind of people who handled situations that couldn't be allowed to exist officially. Counter-siege in progress, Marcus reported from the command post. They're not trying to breach, they're trying to contain. Meaning, they want to starve us out, force negotiation, find out what we know before elimination. Dan checked his ammunition count, enough for extended engagement, but not indefinite resistance. Around him, Goodwin's assets were taking defensive positions throughout the compound, turning the network's own fortifications against their federal protectors. Intelligence transfer complete, he reported. All data copied and transmitted to remote servers. Phase 2 initiation, Goodwin announced. Global network exposure begins now. While Dan had been extracting data from the Virginia compound, Goodwin's international assets had been positioning themselves to release everything simultaneously. News organizations across 6 continents would receive complete documentation of the network's operations within the hour, client lists, financial records, operational procedures, video evidence of systematic abuse. What happens when that information goes public? Dan asked. War, Goodwin replied simply. Real war. Governments will fall, intelligence services will be purged, entire law enforcement agencies will be dissolved and rebuilt. And us. We become the most wanted fugitives in human history. The Federal Containment Force opened fire at 0347 hours, but their initial volleys hit empty positions. Goodwin's people had spent 3 days studying the compound's defensive capabilities and had positioned themselves to maximize the attackers' disadvantages. The network had built their facility to keep people in, not to keep determined enemies out. Casualty report. Dan called out as bullets shattered windows around him. 2 wounded, none killed. They're holding back, trying to minimize damage to the facility. Why? Evidence preservation. Tommy's voice came through the comm from the distant command post. They need to control the narrative, make it look like domestic terrorism instead of rescue operation. Dan's 8-year-old son was providing tactical analysis during a federal assault. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if people weren't dying around him. Incoming aircraft, someone reported. Multiple helicopters, military grade. Dan looked through a shattered window to see attack helicopters approaching from the south. Not police or federal law enforcement. Military assets that shouldn't have been operating on American soil without extraordinary authorization. How high does this go? He wondered aloud. All the way to the top, Goodwin answered. The network has been protected at the highest levels of government for over a decade. We just declared war on people who could authorize nuclear strikes. The helicopters opened fire with machine guns designed to destroy armored vehicles. The compound's walls, built to contain children, offered no protection against military-grade weapons. Dan threw himself behind a concrete barrier as bullets turned the air around him into a metal storm. This is it, he said into his comm. If anyone wants to surrender, now's the time. Negative, came the immediate response from multiple voices. We finished this. Dan smiled despite the circumstances. He was surrounded by the most dangerous men in the world, facing impossible odds against an enemy with unlimited resources, fighting a war that would probably end with all of them dead. It was exactly where he belonged. Tommy, he said into his comm, I need you to know something. What, Dad? I'm proud of you. Whatever happens tonight, remember that you helped save a lot of children. I know. Tommy replied, his voice steady. And Dad, make them pay for what they did to us. Dan checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition, and prepared to teach America's shadow government what happened when they threatened his family. For Tommy, he said. For all the children, Goodwin replied. The final battle began. Chapter 9, Aftermath. 3 weeks after the Virginia compound burned, Dan Banks officially didn't exist. The federal government had classified the entire incident, declared all participants dead, and begun the systematic process of erasing any evidence that the network had ever operated on American soil. News organizations that had received Goodwin's intelligence packages found their stories killed by national security orders, their reporters reassigned, or simply disappeared. But the information had already spread too far to contain completely. Dan sat in a cafe in Prague, reading news reports on a laptop connected through 7 proxy servers. The European Union had launched formal investigations into trafficking networks in 12-member nations. The Australian Parliament was conducting emergency sessions about institutional corruption. 3 African governments had fallen when their involvement in child trafficking was exposed. America remained officially silent, but unofficial sources suggested massive purges within federal law enforcement, intelligence services, and military special operations. The network's American branch was being systematically destroyed, its assets eliminated, its facilities closed and sanitized. "Coffee?" Tommy asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Dan's son looked older than his 8 years, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen the world's worst possibilities and survived them. They'd spent the 3 weeks traveling across Europe, using new identities Goodwin had provided, staying ahead of the international manhunt that followed their escape from Virginia. "Any word from Marcus?" Tommy asked, still in hiding. "The bounty on our heads is up to $50 million now. Each. Combined. Apparently we're worth more as a package deal." Tommy nodded, processing this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance he'd developed since their ordeal began. "What's our next move?" Dan studied his son's face, looking for traces of the innocent child who'd existed before Ellen's betrayal. He found very little. The boy sitting across from him was calculating, observant, emotionally controlled, everything the network had tried to create through their conditioning programs. "What do you want to do?" Dan asked. "I want to find the other facilities Goodwin mentioned. The international operations. I want to help more children like we helped in Virginia." "That's not a life for a child, Tommy." "I'm not a child anymore," Tommy replied simply. "Haven't been since I woke up chained in our basement." Dan realized his son was right. The network had destroyed Tommy's childhood, turned him into something else entirely. The question was whether that transformation was irreversible damage or evolutionary adaptation. "There are 127 confirmed facilities across 6 continents," Dan said, opening another file on the laptop. "Conservative estimates suggest 50,000 children currently being processed through the global network. How long to shut them all down? Years. Maybe decades. And that's assuming we survive the first few operations." Tommy was quiet for a moment, studying the intelligence reports Dan had been reviewing. "What about the money?" "What money?" "The network's financial assets. They processed billions of dollars through this system. Where did it all go?" Dan had been wondering the same thing. The intelligence they'd recovered showed massive revenue streams, but traditional banking records suggested much smaller account balances. The network's wealth had been hidden somewhere, probably in preparation for exactly this kind of systematic exposure. "Goodwin thinks it's in cryptocurrency and offshore accounts," Dan said, "protected by encryption and legal structures that make recovery almost impossible." "Almost," Tommy repeated. "But not completely." Dan looked at his son with new interest. "What are you thinking?" The network needed accountants, financial managers, people who understood complex transactions. They couldn't run a multi-billion-dollar operation using only thugs and killers. So some of those financial people might still be alive, might be willing to cooperate if they thought cooperation was their only chance of survival. Dan realized Tommy was proposing they hunt down the network's surviving financial infrastructure and extract account information through interrogation and intimidation. It was a sound tactical approach, but it would require them to become exactly the kind of people they'd been fighting against. "That's a dangerous path," Dan warned. "Everything's dangerous now," Tommy replied. "The question is whether we want to be dangerous for good reasons or dangerous for no reason." Dan's phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted account. "New intelligence on Asian operations. Facility in Thailand processing 200+ children. Window for intervention closing. H. Goodwin," Dan said, showing Tommy the message. "The facility where his daughter was held." "Probably." He's been planning this for 8 years. Tommy stood up, leaving money on the table for their coffee. Then we better not keep him waiting. As they walked through Prague's crowded streets, Dan realized they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. They weren't trying to return to normal life, weren't planning to eventually stop fighting and settle somewhere safe. They'd become professional soldiers in a war that would probably last the rest of their lives. Tommy, he said as they approached the train station, are you sure about this? Once we commit to this path, there's no going back to being a normal family. We were never a normal family, Tommy replied. Even before Ellen, even before the network. You were always a soldier, Dad. Now I get to be one too. Dan thought about the 8-year-old boy who'd been chained in their basement, terrified and helpless. That child was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, colder, more dangerous. The network had tried to create assets through systematic abuse and conditioning. Instead, they'd created their own perfect enemy. What do you want to be when you grow up? Dan asked as they boarded the train to Vienna. Tommy's smile was empty of childhood innocence, but full of deadly promise. Exactly what I am now, just better at it. The train pulled away from the station, carrying them toward their next mission, their next facility, their next opportunity to save children and destroy monsters. Behind them, Prague disappeared into the distance. Ahead lay Thailand, Henry Goodwin, and a facility processing 200 children who were running out of time. Dan Banks was dead, officially and legally. But the man who'd taken his place was perfectly suited for the war that lay ahead. A father with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, partnered with a son who'd been forged in the network's own crucible and emerged as something they'd never anticipated. Together, they would hunt the monsters who'd destroyed their family. Together, they would save as many children as possible. And together, they would burn down every facility, every safe house, every operational center the network had built over decades of systematic evil. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.